visiting the Russian Revolution and the Arusha Declaration and their legacies, and whether their legacy transpired in our first discussion or we missed out of that. The Bolshevik, was it a Russian revolution? The Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution, Russia, 1917, happened some more than 100 years ago, and the Arusha Declaration happened 50 years later, and last year we celebrated here 50 years of the Arusha Declaration. And some discussions on both took place around the world. And I think we have an opportunity here today, this afternoon, to have some reflections on the Russian Revolution and the Arusha Declaration. I don't know what the panelists are going to say, but it's important to mention one or two things here. One is that, of course, they happened in different times, responding to different contexts. The Russian Revolution, I think, in my view, set in motion a series of revolutions in the world and inspired the rest of the world to carry out revolutions. And that's why some years later, you have revolutions happening in different places in the world. China, 1940s, Cuba, 1950s. And the crave for revolutions or radical transformations in other parts of the world, including Africa, happened. And it inspired the liberation struggles in other continents, particularly in Africa. And the Arusha Declaration happened 1967, 6 years after the independence of Tanzania, and again another attempt to continue the struggle for liberation after the liberation that gave independence to African countries. I remember Amir Cabral saying that liberation, imperialism had two forms, particularly as it was and reflected in Africa. The direct imperialism, that was colonialism, and the second was, and still is, indirect imperialism, and that was neocolonialism. And he was saying that the struggle continues after independence. And I think the Arusha Declaration was an attempt to continue that struggle within the context of Tanzania. Of course, the struggles continue elsewhere in the continent. So with those few points, I would like to invite our four panelists. Matt Swakla, I don't know if that's correct pronouncement. Pronouncing your name, Matt. And then we have Nosim on the right. I'm a leftist, so I may say left and left, so I have no right. Nosim and Andy and Issa on my left. So I'll give them 10 minutes, as you are given to be fair to those who were in the first panel and to these panelists. So they'll be given 10 minutes to make, in my view, their statements that will provoke a discussion. And I will make a bit of modification of the way we are going to conduct our discussion. After they make their opening remarks, they will be part of the entire participants. In other words, they will not be given special time to respond. If they want to participate in the discussion, they will raise their hands and allow them as I allow people from that side. Okay, if that's agreed, let me start with, who is ready? Nosim?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a bit miserable because I didn't finish my chicken, but that's fine. I'll go back for it at some point. I would like to start this conversation with speaking about, I want to think through, as we have thought through, together in Kenya, in Tanzania, in South Africa, about the Arusha Declaration specifically. And I want to think through it in relation to the social movements and the political formations, community organizing that we're involved in. So I would like to start from our current condition in Kenya. I say our because we're working directly with a number of my comrades here from Jinawata, South Africa Pathways, and Kenya. So this is something we've thought through together. I'm just in some ways representing our conversations. So one of the things that I would like to talk about is a very critically class-bound, what I would call catastrophe in Kenya, and especially in the informal urban settlements called extrajudicial executions. So Kenya has one of the highest rates, actually not one of the highest rates of extrajudicial executions in the continent. I think there was a report by Amnesty, I think it had 122 out of 177, something like that. But anyway, between 2013 and 2015, a report done by Nyerere Social Justice Centre reported that there were 803 cases in Mathare alone. Mathare is one of the main informal settlements in Nairobi. So, and this is of course an underestimate because so many people will not come forward with that kind of information for security, because of security risks that they face in doing so, but also in terms of a disillusionment because what has been done, what will be done anyway, even if we report. So, thinking through this, thinking through the condition that we find ourselves in, when people are killed, shot dead at point-blank range by the police, and trying to understand, or trying to encapsulate to really, what can we do in the midst of this complete devastation, in the nature of this like very intense form of state violence. So because this is, of course, this is a legacy of the administrative police founded by the colonial state. The kind of a paramilitary wing to specifically address or enforce customary law, essentially to really contain the African population. So so this is the legacy of that, and of course this also has a lot to do with now anti-terrorist police units that have been deployed in many spaces in the borders, but also within the informal settlements. So the way the state did withdraw, I don't even know if I can say the state historically withdrew in terms of the structural adjustment programs in Kenya, because really it was not there economically, but politically it continues to be have a very violent presence. So, so as we think through this, and I don't know, maybe Gasheke will talk more in terms of the much more specific details of extrajudicial executions, but speaking from the space of community organizing, thinking about the devastation of the communities that we face, what is to be done? How are we going to address this? Because this state violence is addressed at a very particular portion of the population and is class-bound, right? So it's in the informal settlements, essentially. Really, this is the character of these executions. So we've been trying to think about what should we do. And the reason for this is because some of the methods that have been deployed, mainly through non-governmental organizations, Independent Police Oversight Authority, International Justice Mission, independent medical legal units, and so on, have at best not addressed the issue. So the NGOs that have been formed have been, as I was saying, they've had, I think, a very depoliticizing effect on the possibility for political organizing within the communities and for political organizing within social movements. And this is because it becomes a job. It becomes a job where you go from 8 to 5 and you're paid to do this job. And it becomes an incentive. And this is not, I'm not trying to undermine all the efforts, because I think some of the efforts have been truly sincere, but the effects really on the ground, I think, have been that many of the young people have felt that this is something that you want to aspire to run away from poverty, is to have that job. So the way you start to understand and investigate these casualties becomes very kind of pragmatic, detached. And in some ways, it's enforced by the fact that nothing happens, really. You go to IPOA, they send you to ballistics, you wait for it, you go for a post-mortem, they tell you just wait for the post-mortem, we're in a meeting for the next 3 days, so just wait. And you're like, well, people need to be buried and things like that, so maybe we don't have that much time to wait. But so these kind of bureaucracies, and the prospect of earning a very high income, or an income for that matter, through participating in NGOs as a way to address these political issues, has had really, I think, a catastrophic, for me, in my understanding and in the way I view it, for a lot of the young people in terms of mobilizing, especially in terms of political organization. So this is the way in which we are thinking through or approaching the Arusha Declaration, because from our position in Kenya, what are the possibilities of political organizing? We have political education, but then at the same time, the reason why people get into NGOs and in which spaces, for the most part, get depoliticized is because you have to survive, simply. You have to eat, we have to pay for rent and all those things, so we do have to survive, and how are we going to do that? So if social movements are not going to address the question of survival, then we're just going to be running around in circles for a long time. So one of the ways in which you're thinking about survival, one of the ways, and beyond that, is through self-reliance. And this is how we approach the Arusha Declaration. It's from our concrete living conditions, and trying to think about what relevance does it have for us in our current condition, because in Kenya we have a very different legacy. Our projects in terms of self-reliance, which are then called self-help, through Sessional Paper number 10, which was one of the founding national documents, really was encapsulated in that phrase, Harambe, which really had a lot of indigenous traction, and in many of the communities, this self-reliance is not a new thing. It's something that people have known and have organized collectively around economically and politically, and those distinctions are not even there. So what the national project did is appropriated that system, and then internalized its bureaucracy within those systems, and created, essentially made self-reliance really about exchange value. So that when you talk about Harambe in Kenya, you really think about, it's really about fundraising. It's really about money, really, the bottom line. That is the legacy of Harambe in Kenya. So we look to the Arusha Declaration because we thought it had much more radical roots, and was really founded truly on not the African socialism that was really capitalism in Kenya, but truly on a kind of radical idea of African socialism, of Ujamaa. So it's within those paradigms that we were trying to, last year at the beginning when we were thinking about the Arusha Declaration, we organized sessions within the communities to think about how is it relevant to us, and in these communities we have, extrajudicial executions have been rampant, so we were reflecting through that. What is the relevance of the Arusha Declaration, where we feel that the major means of production should belong to the people, both production and distribution belong to the people, as Nyerere said. So these are the thoughts that we are having around, and also in terms of thinking about NGOs as a critique. You don't need money. A poor man doesn't have money, so you can't use money to organize. So how are we going to do this if we don't have money, right? So And also thinking through some of the things that Nyerere was cautioning us about, gifts, loans, that create a kind of dependency. So the problem that Nyerere was thinking through in terms of creating structures, economic structures of self-reliance through Ujamaa villages, right? Very practically, was thinking about them very practically in both the Arusha Declaration, I think, and also in, what's the other big one, sorry, rural, what is it, rural economic? Yes, socialism and rural development. So thinking very seriously through the concrete challenges that are presented in trying to democratically, because this is what he was trying to do, it must be organized for and by the people. Self-reliance must be, so people must decide what they want to plant, how they want to plant it, and how they want to run that organization, or that kind of organizing in the villages. So this is what Nyerere envisioned, and this is what they were having a discussion about in the lectures. You know, how are we going to decide who gets, how are we going to decide what happens to ill people, or people who don't have the capacity to produce as much as other people. So should they get an equal share or not? You know, these very nitty-gritties in terms of really thinking about the daily struggles associated with conceptualizing an Ujamaa village, right? So we're, really excited about thinking of the prospects of this, but then we're also confronted by the fact that, for the most part, it fell apart, and we were wondering, why did it fall apart? What happened to this very radical concept of self-reliance that we want to emulate in the way of cooperative?
I think, finish with that
important question that you have raised.
Okay.
Why did it fall apart? I think that's an important question, and I would like you to end there and leave it to the people to see if they can answer that question. Okay, next is Matt.
I just want to thank the Reef of African Political Economy, the organizing crew, and particularly the organizers here for getting us all together. I think these debates and discussions are really so important. I want to try to make 3 points on this topic. We'll see if I have time. The first one is about the importance of the Russian Revolution as both a sort of democratic revolution from below in 1917, and not just as a revolution that overthrew capitalism, but also as an anti-colonial revolution, and how important it is to sort of think about it in both of those terms. The second thing I want to try to talk about is the way in which the counter-revolution under Stalin really sort of distorted a lot of the anti-colonial aims as well as the democratic aims of 1917, and that it was that model that was sort of on offer when, after World War II, anti-colonial struggle in Africa really sort of exploded and was translated into post-colonial governments. And then the last thing that I'm hoping to get to is to talk about how organizations of Marxist students and workers really kind of challenged and critiqued a lot of the African socialist models that became the sort of official state positions in the 1960s and 1970s, and the importance of those openings. So it's a little ambitious, we'll see. But I wanted to start by talking about the importance of 1917 and the Russian Revolution. And I think that like I said, the importance there is both the sort of democratic nature of the revolution itself in terms of the councils of workers and soldiers and peasants and others that were really sort of at the core of taking power in Russia in 1917. But along with that, the sort of understanding that the leaders of the Bolshevik Party had that the revolution would be absolutely crushed if it could not, if similar revolutions could not spread elsewhere in the world, and how fundamental that was to people like Lenin and Trotsky, and that how important that was not just for revolutions spreading to the major industrial countries of Western Europe, but also the important role that colonies played in that system, and rebellions and anti-colonial resistance in the colonies for weakening the capitalist system internationally. So you see the emergence of the Comintern, this organization that was intended not, as it sort of later became, to sort of spread Russian influence, but actually as a body to try to figure out how to build those sorts of international solidarities. And you see in the first 4 meetings of the Comintern the importance of proposals that were adopted and proposed not only by people like Lenin, but also M.N. Roy, the Indian Marxist, Claude McKay, the black U.S. Representative to one of the Comintern Congresses, is that really sort of made anti-racism and anti-colonialism a fundamental part of the Comintern sort of goals in challenging capitalism on a global scale. And I think that this took a lot of important sort of forms in trying to support a lot of the early sort of more nascent anti-colonial movements after World War I. And so you see in Europe through the European Communist parties, which in many ways had a lot of problems and were often very resistant to sort of taking on questions of racism and anti-colonialism. But you see the important role that in the space that was created there for people like Lamine Senghor through the League Against Imperialism and the Intercolonial Union, for people like Lamine Senghor to build solidarity movements in response to a rebellion in Central Africa in the end of the 1920s, which he sort of worked closely with the French Communist Party. You also see the importance that black communists based in the US, although many from the Caribbean, played in building links with British West Africa. Obviously George Padmore being the most sort of crucial in his travels in the 1930s, or in the end of the 1920s, in making contacts with people like I.T.A. Wallace Johnson, who formed the West African Youth League as a sort of response to the conservatism of the sort of early sort of anti-colonial organizations in British West Africa. And you see the kind of importance of these links in the 1930s, where solidarity campaigns around the Scottsboro Boys or the Hands Off Abyssinia campaigns after the Italian invasion of Ethiopia were able to sort of be truly internationalist campaigns that had real roots in South Africa and in West Africa through these linkages with the Comintern. And I think it's important not to sort of underestimate those forces, although they were small, and those connections back to the Comintern. In the 1930s, when Du Bois's Pan-African Congresses and when Garveyism was very much on the decline, the Comintern sort of stood as kind of the lone body, international body, calling for the decolonization and the end of colonial rule in Africa. And I think that important legacy can't be forgotten. While at the same time we have to recognize that in the 1930s there was a process going on whereby the Stalinist counter-revolution was really sort of undermining the anti-colonial aims of the early Comintern, and really sort of led to a kind of a break from the anti-colonialism of those early years. And I think that it was this sort of version of the Russian Revolution and this version of sort of Soviet foreign policy that is the one that's sort of on offer and available, like I said, after World War II, when anti-colonial movements break out really across the continent. And I think to sort of understand that, it's useful to sort of look at the rise of Stalin and the bureaucracy around him in the Soviet Union as really a sort of product of the failure of revolutions, to spread elsewhere, and the crushing really of the Russian working class during the Civil War of the 19-teens and 20s. And I think the resulting sort of retreat and Stalin's sort of justification for maintaining power really came in the form of I think most importantly, the idea of socialism in one country, which was very much a rejection of the early ideals and the early sort of goals and positions of the Russian Revolution. But I think that socialism in one country was this way of sort of then kind of justifying the forced collectivization of the peasantry, and out of that extremely bloody and exploitative process, the very rapid sort of industrialization of the Soviet Union, and this sort of legacy and this sort of myth that you can catch up in a very short period of time. And I think that those ideas were that sort of allure of being able to catch up was in part very appealing to a lot of emerging African anti-colonial leaders in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so you see actually Nkrumah speaking in a lot of that language already in the 1950s in terms of needing to sort of catch up quickly for fear that neocolonialism will otherwise undermine African independence. But I think at the same time there was also this sense by the 1950s and the 1960s of the Soviet Union also as a Cold War threat. And that certainly was sort of part and parcel of the impetus for the Third World Movement in trying to sort of form a bloc of newly independent states that could resist the sort of being pulled into or under the tutelage of either the United States or the Soviet Union. And I think in Africa, in many places, that manifested itself in the form of African socialism as a sort of version of that third world goal. And I think the arguments around African socialism were based, not just here in Tanzania, but elsewhere, around the idea that pre-colonial African societies did not have class differentiations of class, and that colonialism, although having introduced elements of capitalism sort of almost externally, had not really created either a ruling class or a working class in most of Africa. And this kind of rejection of the need for class struggle meant, in the terms of people like Nkrumah and Nyerere, but also others, people like Sekou Touré and the Keitas in Mali, that the quest for socialism could be brought by an administration, by a state that transcended class, because there was no class struggle to be fought to bring socialism. And in this sort of thinking, the single party could sort of represent all interests. And so this is where you see this sort of era of both a real sort of quest for equality and a quest to sort of get out of the colonial relationships of the past, but also a sort of developmental paternalism, whether that was in the form of Nkrumah's industrialization campaigns or in the form of Nyerere's self-reliance. And I was thinking about what Newsom was saying about the sort of ways that ideas of self-reliance and practices of self-reliance already existed, but then sort of get appropriated and co-opted as a sort of top-down, state-driven sort of policy. And the result was that there was no real space for sort of independent organization within this model, or any sort of initiative that would sort of disrupt this sort of developmental paternalism. And so what that resulted in was the making illegal of strikes, of trade unions, the suppressing of the demands of ethnic minorities, and of course, when people didn't want to follow through, the coercion, including here, of course, in Tanzania, towards the end of the villagization campaigns and the forced removals that went with that. And so I think that it's, I think it's important that despite the fact that there were a lot of sort of lineages that led into these ideas of African socialism and the policies that went with them, I do think that the sort of model of socialism in one country, the ability to sort of delink, the ability to rapidly really sort of squeeze productivity out in such a way that it allows for sort of catching up to the global capitalist powers, was really sort of crucial to that first generation of so many first generation African leaders. And it's true that in some cases people like Nyerere did not look to the Soviet Union. In fact, was very highly critical and rejected. Instead, looked much more so to China. But for him, the Great Leap Forward, another sort of version of I think that same kind of model, was equally important. The last thing that I want to talk about, although I probably don't have time, 1 minute, was just that I think that being said, the legacy of African socialism has this important, albeit contradictory legacy, which is that it also sort of created the space in sort of proclaiming the necessity of equality and of a struggle against capitalism in some form or another. It created sort of spaces where people did fight back and did try to take control of these programs and bring them into their own hands. And so you see that when there are sort of openings like Nkrumah's Second Revolution in 1960, the revolution in Congo-Brazzaville of 63 to 68, or Mwongozo, the guidelines in Tanzania in 1971, you see these sort of openings of working class struggle, of student organizing, and of Marxist organization sort of challenging a lot of the sort of dominant ideas of the state. And I think that, that opens up the space in the late 1960s, 1970s for the emergence of sort of more explicitly Marxist left that is very critical of what they see as the sort of arrival of a bureaucratic bourgeoisie, right? That's the sort of terminology.
Isa will speak on that. Thank you very much. The bureaucratic bourgeoisie. He is a creator of the concept of the bureaucratic bourgeoisie. Hope you will expand on that when you have the opportunity. Okay, Mark. Andy.
Leo and York and others who encouraged me first to write an article about the Russian Revolution and its implications for the developmental, problem or developmental challenge. And so the first part has already been printed or published, and the second part is, we hoped that it is already out, but it will be in the next issue of the journal. So, having said this, I would stop with the commercials. So, invited to read it. And I'm also glad, and I would like to thank Matt, who has explained a lot about the history and what happened in the Soviet Union, and how it impacted on Africa, because I'm not an expert in Russian history. And I'm in my professional training, and I did this for a while in academia, but I also tried to put it into practice somewhere later in the framework of my work in Africa. I'm a developmental economist, and I know economists always assume to be a little bit out of touch with reality. I hope to recover from this, but I would actually, that's probably part of the legacy, if you're an economist, put up a very theoretical question right now, and it may be that inspires you to do a discussion. So where shall I start? Marxism, the difference of Marxism to the rest of philosophic approaches to human history is that Marxist thinking is about that human beings are, in the way of, in the history, they are bringing about historical formations of production or productive forces and productive relations. So those who are corresponding to each other, the famous quote of Marx is society of, the steam engine creates capitalism, society of windmills creates feudalism. So meaning that if you have such a concept that there are different historical formations and so or types of society, then you have a problem, and this problem does not occur if you are, let's say, in a neoclassic vision on that commodity production has always been a part of the human society, and whole history is just an expansion of commodity production. There has never been something different. So if you don't believe this, you have the problem that you have to explain how human society moves from one economic structure into another economic society. So the crucial point is the transfer, or the transition from, let's say, from a slave society to feudal society, from a feudal society to a capitalist society, whatever. So, and the Russian Revolution actually marks this very moment where you can say, okay, a group of this, let's say, encouraged and brave people tried to put into practice something that was part of the Marxist view of how humanity develops in order to achieve socialism or communism. So, and it goes without saying that this can only happen in very crucial and very destabilized social conditions. Russia was probably really destabilized and an antagonic or whatever kind of state towards the end of the First World War. So it opened up this opportunity. But we saw other revolutions of the same kind, which also took place in situations where the whole societies were heavily destabilized, and there was an option to put this into practice. So the Russian Revolution was the first attempt to put into practice what Marx believed, that revolutions are the locomotive forces of human development, that this is the way to gain socialism or communism. So, having said this, I want to go into the details that I have written up or I have tried to address in my articles. So that means that you have these groups of people, which is not an easy thing to say. It's not just to exchange the leading classes or the ruling classes and the governing classes in order to get access to wealth and to enrich yourself. It is that someone takes up political power in order to change the whole system. So this has not happened too often. Maybe Lenin was certainly such a person, Mao Zedong was certainly such a person, Fidel Castro was a person of this kind, and to a certain extent Nyerere as well. So, but being willing to change this whole society, not just to copy the other one that has already been here there, you should not underestimate what this creates. Secondly, you have to be committed for a long, long time. Yeah, it is like that. So you have, it's not just 4 years or 5 years and the next democratic election are taking place and you're all chased out of power. So you have to be committed. That's what explains a lot why these regimes are basically undemocratic. If you identify democracy with elections, with fair and free elections. So I'm of the opinion, although I know that it's difficult to confess this here. I think the core of democracy is not just elections. This should be a little bit more. But anyway, so this explains a lot about the problems with democracy, and you have to have resources to implement the new society, to build up the new society. Kuchi Tegemea, this was what Nyerere already understood, that you have to not only to rely on foreign aid and other, let's say, solidarity things, but you have to mobilize your own resources. So the next revolution will not be funded. That's one of the things. And when I attended a workshop in Dakar, where the question was, how can social movements be funded? Has anybody seriously asked, how is the working class being funded for the revolution? So without sponsoring this, no, it will not happen. No. So this is a completely different approach. So, and now this is the final thing I would like to discuss with you later on. So, but what we saw from all these attempts, all of them somehow failed, or about to fail, or developed unexpectedly into another direction, if we look at China, for example. So can we say, or do we have to say, do we have to come to the conclusion that the concept of revolution has failed? So if so, what is the way this society will change? How do we achieve social change in the Marxist view of how humankind develops? If the revolution is not the right thing to do, what is the right thing to do? So this is the really serious question, and I think Marx himself, he stood under pressure to explain this, and the only thing what he could do in order to elaborate the future was to look back in the past. And he saw the French Revolution, the English Revolution, and so he probably just assumed that this is the way forward. But we may have to realize or conclude that the complicated, differentiated societies like last stages of imperialist capitalism are probably too different in order to mobilize just one political force, like just the working class and just this force or that force. Maybe some people like Negri and others who were talking about multitude, and other people who are talking about social movements, although the term is very, very tricky here. What is a social movement? Is it 7 people who confess themselves and so we are representing the Jack dwellers? No? Or is it, how long do you have to last, and what is your, how can you explain whom you're representing? How can you claim to represent the Jack dwellers if you're only 15 people? So that is another thing, but we are almost clear that there is a lot more than just the working class. There are feminist movements, there are environmental movements, there are people who are fighting for, to save animals or whatever, and against climate change. So what we know now is we can define the parameters of the new society, although the name is not that clear, whether it's socialism or communism. Maybe we will call it later something else. But we have to have some ideas of the parameters. First thing is, it must be certainly much more equal. So the tendency for unequal development, or the tendency to increase the gap between the rich and the poor, cannot continue as it is. So, and this equality would also mean access to resources. Access to the few resources that we have, and because we have to realize that the planet is a more or less closed system, so we don't have a second one, and I think we will not make it to another planet somewhere out in the space. So meaning we have to survive this or there's no survival. Well, the second thing is we have to save resources. So we have to come into cyclic production cycles, or the production cycle that use the resources many times. So this is the second. And the last thing is we have to do this in a way that preserves the basic conditions of human life on Earth. That means climate change is a real threat to us, to our lives. It's not a threat for insects and other animals. It is just our lives. So that we have to understand these parameters are necessary to be achieved. But how do we do this? Do we have to abandon the revolution? How can we achieve it? And it's urgent that we achieve it. So that's the question that I leave to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Many frontiers, many issues. How do you organize one movement, one force to counter the hegemony? I think it was the issue of the hegemony was raised in the morning. And who is the hegemony today, and how is it organized, and how is it working? Issa.
Okay, thank you, Maza. I skipped the introductory remarks to save time, and given the constraint of time and the format of this conversation, I want to present the quintessential of the Arusha Declaration in the form of 5 theses. If I was talking academically, I would have called them hypotheses which need to be proved. But I'm not talking academically, I'm talking politically, that I call them theses. Thesis 1. The Arusha Declaration was and was conceived to be a national project, not a social project. And Mwalimu Nyerere was very clear on this. He often said that he had to build a nation out of motley of tribes. That Tanzania did not inherit a nation from colonialism. What they inherited was tribes. This is Mwalimu conceptualism. And to build that nation, unity was central and fundamental. And that unity could only be built by the center and around the center. And the center was the state, which he headed. Now, there's some contradiction in terms. The state that was a colonial state. And here the colonial state was perceived as agency to build a nation. Although, to be fair, Tanzania was one of the, I think, probably only African country which did radically attempt to rebuild the state and state institutions. It was the only country which dismantled its army and built a new army. Tanzanian army that we have is not a colonial army. But Nyerere acknowledged that in building a nation state, his concept of national state came from Western political and historical legacy. And he acknowledged it. He said that there are many things I don't agree with Western ideologies. But how can I not agree with the outlook on nation state? And it is this, for this reason, that he could not tolerate centrifugal forces. Okay? Those forces which would wreck his national project. And that explains the suppression of organizational, independent organization that you talked, one of the things. And his constant refrain was national unity. National unity runs like a red thread in Mwalimu's politics. 2. In the Arusha Declaration itself, the longest and the pithiest section is on self-reliance. This was drafted by Nyerere himself. In fact, when the document was presented to the National Executive Committee of the party for adoption, it did not contain the section of self-reliance. Nyerere explained it orally and asked the National Executive Committee to give a mandate to draft it. Many commentators at the time, including we on the left, had, in my view, now looking back, a kind of superficial understanding of self-reliance. For example, our biggest critique of self-reliance was that after the Arusha Declaration, we took more aid from Western countries than we used to have before. We saw this as a critique of self-reliance. But Mwalimu's conception of self-reliance was political. And that conception was the right of people to make their own decisions. Right of people to self-determination. That was the concept of self-reliance, which fits in very well with his national project. Meaning, in two senses, national independence and state sovereignty. Okay? So this again shows that the national project was central even to the Arusha Declaration. In fact, in the last period of Mwalimu in the 80s, when there was intense discussion with the IMF and so on, many of us did not quite understand at that time, but not enough research was done. By the way, there was intense struggle in the party on the question of IMF between the nationalist and the neoliberal tendency. And many people commented, particularly from the West, both from the left and the right, that Nyerere is irrational not to accept devaluation, which was the most rational economic decision to make. But for Nyerere, devaluation of currency went to the heart of his national project, of national sovereignty. Because monetary policy, monetary fiscal policies is the sign of sovereignty of the nation. But this is true. On the level of political philosophy, there is one fundamental link between the Arusha Declaration socialism and Marxist socialism, as concretized in the Russian Revolution. And there is one fundamental break. The link is on the notion of equality, human equality. Nyerere once said, or more than once said, and I agree with him, that you can't be a socialist if you don't believe in human equality. And he has written a wonderful essay on human equality, but it's in Swahili. It's never been translated. He also wrote a wonderful poem on equality, which again has not been translated. I guess if it was translated to English, it will lose its real flavor. All its other principles, political principles, non-discrimination, individual freedom, national liberty, etc., flowed from this central idea of human equality. Number 2, Mwalimu's notion of equality is different from the bourgeois notion of juridical equality. All are equal before law. Nyerere's notion of equality went beyond that. It integrated within it the notion of equity and dignity. And he wrote in this essay that I'm talking about, a wonderful passage, where he says that there's one thing even God cannot do. God can do many things. But one thing God cannot do is cannot take away human dignity from the human being. So the bourgeois equality is constructed on the legal plane. Nyerere's equality was constructed on the social plane. Kind of it comes close to the notion of social justice as opposed to legal justice. But still within the overall bourgeois paradigm. Once Nyerere, in various teachings that we had at the university, said, you know, I'm bourgeois at heart. If you get the project of the working people, which was articulated in the traditional language of Worker Peasant Alliance. But as I was saying in the morning, actually the concept of working people better captures this. But we can have a discussion on that. By the way, not as a concept, but as a term, it is used in Lenin, working people. Second, Nyerere never accepted class struggle. In fact, Arusha Declaration was supposed to prevent the development of incipient classes. All the workers and peasants are mentioned in the Arusha Declaration. They are seen as the victims of capitalist exploitation and beneficiaries of socialism, not as the builders, fighters, and defenders of socialism. So it was not part of Nyerere political strategy or outlook to mobilize and organize workers and peasants for building and defending socialism. 3. In fact, by 1975, when the party, meaning the party state by now, is declared to be supreme, Nyerere had already alienated the peasants and workers. Peasants to forced realization, workers to forced suppression of the working class struggles between 1973 and 1975. Very intense struggles, a real class struggle, okay, in that period. But that was suppressed. For the first time, and workers and peasants were reduced to be spectators. This was recognized and acknowledged by the party Mongo's party guidelines of 1981. As another document produced by the party, not known, not translated, not talked about, not analyzed. Even some of those who were involved in that committee do not remember it. It's an amazing document, 1981, okay, which does a self-criticism and assesses the Arusha Declaration. After 14 years, it says, under the Arusha Declaration, we have built a new class. And text on the debate of the 70s at the university, which talk about the bureaucratic and the state bourgeoisie. This is a party document. But it came too late in the day. By that time...
Final thesis?
Sorry?
Your final thesis?
No, this is my thesis 3. I have 2 theses, but that will be short.
You go to your final thesis now. You can combine the 3 into 1.
Okay, let me quickly try to do this. I said that by that time the party became a party of bureaucrats rather than a party of cadres. Again recognized by 1981 movement. This is 4. What are the class basis of Nyerere's national project? First, as I said, subjectively Nyerere saw this as a mass project, not a class project. Objectively, actually the class basis was a middle peasantry. Neither exploiters nor exploited. This is the best of Nyerere socialism. Only in 1989, again amazing speech that Nyerere made, which has not been translated. For the first time, Nyerere made a distinction between comprador bourgeoisie and national bourgeoisie. The term which we have all forgotten, we do not even talk about it in the morning. But for him, his national bourgeois would come from the urban-based entrepreneurs. This is identified as the private sector. It is very interesting that another Tanzanian leader who has not been talked about much and was least talked about, Edward Moringa Sokoine, who lived a very short life. For him, he had a different vision of national bourgeois. For him, the authentic national bourgeois who originate in the ranks of the rich peasantry, kulaks. Okay? And you know the kulaks were actually demonized in the Arusha Declaration as Makabaya. Sokoine's rich peasant would be based on agrarian accumulation from below, as opposed to Nyerere's bourgeois, which would be accumulation from above. Of course, this is further research and reflection. My final thesis, Chair. My final thesis, definitely. Because of this, of course, at the time, Nyerere's national project appeared very durable compared to many African countries, but it has not survived the neoliberal onslaught. Okay? I'm not going to details about that. My final thesis is that now currently we are witnessing an upsurge of nationalism. An upsurge of nationalism, not only here, but elsewhere as well, all over the world. But I want to submit, and we shall talk about it more in the public lecture, that this nationalism is a backlash to neoliberalism. It has very little or nothing in common with the nationalism or the neoliberation period, which was progressive, Nyerere's nationalism, and which was part of the anti-imperialist national project. As I said, we'll be discussing more about this in our lecture. And finally, legacy of the Arusha Declaration. Well, with the end of the triumphant neoliberal period, Arusha Declaration is coming back. And you can see our young people talking about the Arusha Declaration. That's the legacy of the Arusha Declaration. Thank you.
Okay, I thank our panelists for provoking a discussion, and I hope we are going to have a very lively discussion on the various issues that they have pointed out. I can see one hand already raised. So the discussion is open, all of us. Okay.
I'm definitely coming from Kenya. They come from the same background, see. But also to say that when we were commemorating the Arusha Declaration, for example in Kenya last year, where she has mentioned, I think the carryover of that process was a dilemma. I think which is this dilemma, which is I think faced by all such movements, is that the foundational and philosophical foundation of it all was self-reliance and socialism. But now, she has said that Nyerere had the state machinery to be able to implement the Arusha Declaration. When it comes to social movements, definitely, and these social movement activists have no control of the state, what happens? And I think this is where we'll come back, whether the revolution that was being looked upon by the Arusha Declaration is still possible within the sector of the social movements. And I think this is a bigger dilemma. Because to me, whereas the social movements themselves have no state apparatus, I think what you talk about, social movements being able to liberate some zones, for example, they work in. The sites of resistance they work in, liberating those zones would be a form of revolution. And I think this is a silent revolution we don't really acknowledge, inspired by those ideas. And I think this is well done when social movements don't see, they could focus on the final goal, the final revolutions. But once they work within practical levels of self-reliance and ideological, those zones they liberate is a form, to me, of the revolution.
I think that there was a misunderstanding in what some people were saying about Marx and class. Marx's ideas of class came through practice, experience, consciousness. And you can see that particularly in 1844, when he's dealing with workers in Silesia and Paris and Manchester. That's where his ideas of the working class come from. Now, in research that we conducted in Soweto in Johannesburg, we also worked from where people were at, what they were thinking about in terms of class. And what that showed was some contradictory notions. So people could see themselves as working class and could also see themselves as being middle class. But certainly people could see themselves as being working class. Those people who saw themselves as being working class were essentially the workers. Other people who saw themselves as being partial workers, poor and so on, tended not to be employed workers. They saw themselves differently. The way in which we interpreted the situation was to distinguish between the poor, which is how many people describe themselves in South Africa, and workers, i.e. employed workers. and distinguish them on the basis of different relations to the means of protest. Not different relations to the means of production, which is a different issue altogether. In other words, there's not a fundamental class difference between the poor and the workers, but there are differences in terms of people's practical experiences of struggle. And it seems to me that's very important in terms of some of the discussion we've had already, that we need to look at where people are at, where they're fighting, how do they identify themselves if we're to transform society. And it may well be that people identify themselves in non-class terms, as women, as students, and so on and so forth. And that's taken into account by Lenin, particularly in What Is to Be Done. We had a very, I think, significant event in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in November, and it's one of the reasons certainly why I couldn't attend the Accra meeting. And it was a debate. It was a debate, very significant debate, between people from the South African Communist Party, from the EFF, from NUMSA, the largest union in Africa, from the far left, from even some anarchists, from the PAC, from Black Consciousness and so on. And much of the difference was around the question of how one interprets what is to be done. Now, what is to be done is really about Lenin arguing for the way in which the working class, the communist ideal, is to be a tribune of the oppressed, central to his thinking. In other words, that the working class, if it's to be successful in transforming society, has to relate to the struggles of the oppressed, the women, blah, 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 blah. And that needed to be countered to the view of the South African Communist Party, the EFF, and so on, which was to use what is to be done to talk about discipline. Discipline, comrades, a top-down approach. Now, that's not what is to be done was about. And so there are these two notions, and I think it comes into one of the contributions, where the thinking about Lenin gets divided up, and you can see it particularly through What Is to Be Done. In the South African case, you can also see it in terms of debates in 1928 around the national question. And central to those questions was that of stagism. So you get coming in from the Comintern, and it affects arguments in America on the Negro question and so on. You get coming in the idea that there are stages in the revolution. And that's permeated the South African Communist Party from the late 1920s right through to the present. That there should be a capitalist stage, effectively that's what they're talking about, a capitalist stage, and only later a socialist stage. And what concerns me about some of the debate which we're beginning to have is that rather than it being based upon Marx and Lenin, it's being based upon this notion of stagism. And I think that although there are many good things that Nyerere had to say, that the fact that he's withdrawing from a notion of class means that in practice he accepts some form of stagism. Not necessarily a capitalism in the Western capitalist sense, but nevertheless that there should be a position, a situation which develops, which is not that of promoting the working class in struggle. And it seemed to me that Comrade Shivji, that early on, that's what you identified with. The importance of supporting the working class against the limitations being imposed on the struggle by Nyerere and others.
This one is about kind of the last point that was made about stagism, but relating to Nassim's intervention on the legacy of political violence. And I would like some dialogue within the group. There have been some theorists or some political commentators who have talked about Tanzanian relationship to the rest of the region, and how there is an absence of certain forms of political violence that permeate through the rest of the continent. And how does that relate to, Nassim, your idea about self-reliance in relation to the ideas that you're drawing from? Number two, I want to kind of dispute, there was maybe it was a joke, maybe you meant something quite different about no social movement has made asks where to be funded. Something like that. I can't think of that being true for any group in history. If you wanted arms, you would need to source the arms from somewhere, unless you were literally working in a munitions factory. If you wanted to start a mine workers union, many of them had to get donations, some of them from left movements in Europe. So I think that question is actually quite central, and it has actually shaped the trajectory of many movements, particularly on the continent. Who you had to accept, either because you had a particular affinity to individuals, you were aligned with ideologically, shaped the trajectory of movements, and shaped what made it onto party manifestos. So in relating to Nassim, I wanted to get a sense of whether when you say self-reliance? Are you thinking along the lines of, because you're not thinking, what I'm hearing is you're not saying self-reliance coming from the top, but something from below. Are you thinking in terms of cooperatives? And can we then have the conversation of where do the support and who are the appropriate constituents and allies of movements that do cooperatives in the name of self-reliance?
Show two very different alternatives in terms of largely rural, non-industrialized countries. And for me, the Russian Revolution shows that it is possible to have a socialist revolution in a country where the vast majority of people are not workers, but are peasants. That is a revolution that is actually led by the organised working class. And that's what happened in Russia. I mean, essentially, the Russian Revolution, at least initially, started in Petrograd. So it was, and you had combined and uneven development. So you had the very great unevenness between Russia and Western Europe, industrialized, the far bigger GDPs and so on, Western Europe and Russia. But you also had in Petrograd were some of the biggest factories in the world. So the ammunitions factories. So you had a very organised working class who were able to take power in Petrograd, and then the revolution spread to the rest of Russia. So they took power in Moscow sometime afterwards. I mean, clearly the hope was, and Lenin identified, that the actual success of the revolution was completely dependent on spreading that to Western Europe as well. And obviously that didn't happen. I mean, you know, the alternative view, as Shifty outlined, was one of national development. And, you know, a completely different view. And then we had the degeneration of the Russian Revolution and the Stalin coming to power. And again, there, the degeneration into national development and, as was said, collectivization of the peasant, forced industrialization, absolute massive repression of the working class. So complete overturn of the revolution being the working class themselves taking over the factories in Petrograd. You then got the complete reversal of massive repression of the working class, and using that, and the collectivization of the peasants, and using that to build the industrialization in one country. And it, as I said, I mean, it's that model, that Stalinist model of socialism in one country that was actually seen as attractive in terms of the problem of how in Tanzania, for example, how do you actually build a society in a largely rural country? And I mean, for me, I mean, the Russian Revolution shows us an alternative way forward that shows a democratic society, how the beginnings of building a democratic and extremely egalitarian society. And just finally, I mean, I think that in terms of, it's incredibly important, I think, that aren't brought up is the question of climate change and the environmental rift. And it seems to me that has completely closed off the possibility of industrialization in the global south. That is not possible, it seems to be, on the basis of, you know, anything like industrialization of, you know, which is a carbon-based industrialization, and that has completely cut off industrialization and economic development for the global south. So we then have the question of, you know, well, what are we going to do? And it's, you know, as was outlined, I mean, I think there's some basics in terms of what are needed. But it's that, for me, the Russian Revolution provides an alternative which is not predicated on industrialization and economic growth.
that for me, there is enough wealth in the world now. We don't need massive growth of GDP. If that current wealth was spread out equally, then there is
how is that going to be done? That's the question. Yeah, I think that's a known fact, for not a new thing, that there is enormous wealth. For example, if you're talking about food, there is enormous food produced and available, but there are so millions of people who are dying of hunger. So why? And how do you change that? I think that's part of the discussion here. How do you carry out a revolution? The kind of solidarity, I think the morning someone raised the issue of what kind of solidarity, what kind of alliance, and how that becomes important in pushing forward the revolution. Before you go, he wanted to ask him a question, and he's still holding the mic. So I will allow you to ask him, and then we'll come back.
Thank you, Chair. Just before I ask my question, I would say more equal society and industrialization would mean deindustrialization in other parts of the world. Be aware of this. There's not to say there's no additional industrialization anymore in the rest of the world. So, but my question is, do you think that Stalin is already the end of the revolution? You were mentioning Stalin as if when Stalin took power, then the revolution got finished and was off. So if this is the truth, I'm not sharing this opinion. I think Stalin is the direct consequence of the way the revolution was. Was implemented, to say a thing like that. So, in my understanding, Stalin is the natural consequence of the way the revolution has happened. So, what do you think about that? Because if you are right, then the whole thing lasted 10 years, not even 10 years. This gives a very bleak.
Do you want to respond to that in half a minute, or we should let it be picked by other people?
The counter-revolution in, let's say, roughly the 1920s.
Okay. Thank you very much, my sister.
He came into power. He also believes that he authored a document which was supposed to be followed, the 10-point program. And the whole point about this morning
is that Uganda?
Kind of, yes. the discussion of revolution as a model, are we in a sense saying that you will have these individual strongmen come up with their own views of how things should be done, and then enforce them, not sell them, enforce them on others to follow? Because the question we're asking is that why did the Arusha Declaration fail? Why are these leaders behaving the way they are? So when President Museveni came, when we compare his writing, the early days of his time are completely different from what is happening now. And so the whole idea of the human agency comes back into play. Who is in control that is driving this whole process that will make it succeed or not succeed? To what degree is the agency there for the strongman in the long run, but also to what degree do those whom he claims he is representing, because they are all he's here, he is representing, are they with him? And it also goes back to that whole idea of NGOs saying that we are representing the views of the people and likening ourselves to social movements, when actually when you dissect the NGO, vis-a-vis the people that they claim to represent, to what degree do we actually have the mandate to do that? So when we are discussing revolutions as a model, are we sort of looking at the strongman coming in? I mean, even our host country had a situation like that very recently when, ruled by decree, I have decreed that this is the right way to do it. No debate about it, get it done in this way. We have a situation where one of the nations in East Africa that is so-called developing first, it is ruled by, it has been said by the great leader, the great leader requests that it is done this way, and this is how it is being done. So we need to sort of look at that in the sense of how does that then play in to the actual agency of the broader base of people and the individual revolutionary, I think.
The individual revolutionaries, of Latin States, the idea of the petty bourgeois committing a class suicide and being part of the masses and their constant and leading a struggle for liberation and revolution. And probably what you are bringing up is is there a possibility of a petty bourgeois who has committed class suicide to be reborn again as a petty bourgeois? And what happens when that happens, especially to the masses who are part of that particular process? Anyway, let's go on. Next.
Two things. One is that the illustrations from the panel around the Soviet Union and Tanzania are illustrations where the state has been seized and policy emerges around which there is much conflict, and ultimately a undermining of the, in the Soviet case, principles of the uprising. It's interesting that we don't, at one level, we clearly do not live in revolutionary times, and that's a problem for us because we historically would seek to identify a social movement with which we could partake in attempts to undermine the efficacy of neoliberalism in the intense crisis. So there is an intense crisis, but we aren't in revolutionary times. Although there have been two recent uprisings which are the elephants in this room. That's Egypt and Tunisia. And in both those cases, where they were uprisings and not revolutions, there was a significant groundswell of rural transformation, especially in Tunisia, not so much in Egypt, but there are major challenges from the countryside. The Tunisian uprising actually emerges from the countryside, not from the towns. Egypt is rather different because of the textile workers in Mahalla, in the north of Cairo. This is the greatest concentration of industrial workers anywhere in the Middle East. So you have very sharp contrast, but clear class dimensions. And here, class is used as an analytical category. It's simply an analytical category to represent social relationships of exploitation and appropriation. It's not a big deal. Whether it's a northern concept or a southern concept, it represents an analysis of our different realities, and the realities of the poor and the realities of the rich. If you are poor, you're subjected to exploitation. If you're rich, you're one of the promoters of that exploitation. But interestingly, in the case of Tunisia, where there has been less of a kickback of counter-revolutionary forces, although there has been a counter-revolution, there are pockets of rural uprising that continue and promote food sovereignty. Now, food sovereignty here is a gestalt, it's an epistemological shift away from food security to understand the rural conditions of existence and to understand the absolute significance that people need to feed themselves. And so food sovereignty here becomes actually something around which we can all seek to mobilize. And the biggest social movements on the planet today are focused on food sovereignty. Via Campesina is the world's biggest social movement. Land of People's Party in Brazil, biggest South American social movement. So these are movements which we can identify with, we can understand, we can fight with, and we can contest. And in southern Tunisia, there's a very interesting Gemna oasis. This is an oasis where farmers have taken land back. They are distributing the outcomes of their growing season. They're sharing labour. They're reinvesting into the oasis in a way that is a direct challenge to the old regime's bourgeoisie that had dispossessed the farmers during the periods of the dictatorship. So I think I would encourage us to think about positive illustrations where there are small pockets of opportunity and optimism. We are desperate to find those optimistic moments, but to seek that optimism in an understanding theoretically of the crisis that we are in and that neoliberalism is in, but we seek to find social movements that try to assemble an alternative agenda.
So these aren't very well thought through, but I was kind of thinking through what you were saying, Lisa, about the way in which this issue of extrajudicial killings has become depoliticised, and it made me think about how it's been depoliticised in at least two ways. One is the way in which the struggle against it is waged, in terms of it being very legalistic and through the courts and petitions and documentation and numbers and so forth, but also then in the narrative and the discussion around it, in the way that there's a kind of idea that these things are obviously wrong according to our kind of human rights discourse, when actually when you're speaking to people on the issue is much more complicated than that, because of the way in which youth, and especially underemployed young men in informal settlements, have been criminalised to a certain extent, whereby actually there's an idea that if you highlight this, there'll be a kind of reaction against it, but actually it's not facing the way in which, for many people, this is justified as a means to try and deal with criminalisation, with these kind of criminal youth who pose a threat, either because they're used by politicians or because they will steal something off you or whatever. So there seems to be two different issues here in terms of the way in which the struggle is waged, but also the way in which the problem is framed, and this kind of, at the moment, and it's not that there's no engagement with it, but an insufficient engagement with the way in which this whole group of people have been, to a certain extent, criminalised, and the implications of that, and how you try and address that. And I would be really interested, I know you got cut off, I'd be really interested in you raising your hand and finishing your point about, from those conversations that you are having, what would be the conclusions about how you do use this idea of self-reliance to deal with some of these issues? Were there any conclusions? Is there, a movement happening that's going to repoliticize this? I'd be really interested to hear.
So that's a direct question. So,
of extrajudicial executions, I think we are painfully aware of it. It also has to do with the legacy of what would be called social movements, because they were mainly, at least in the recent history since 1992, the 1992 multi-party democracy, were really framed around, against the tyranny of the president. So it was very much based on freedom within the notions of electoral democracy. So, and that brought with it, the whole discourse, the whole liberal, the discourse and the institutions of liberal democracy, which include human rights NGOs and so on, and rightfully so at the time responding. But then now what it means is that in terms of looking at this, in terms of the class dimensions, the legacy of living in a settler colony, and the historical legacy of that, and then trying to understand it through the lens of liberal democracy in terms of human rights and so on, and the constitutionalism is probably, those are the tools that were available and have been available in that duration of time. But I think there's an increasing consciousness in terms of for the people on the ground understanding within the grassroots that this is by far insufficient in terms of dealing practically with what it means to on one hand, get used to people, the criminalization, especially of young men, although now we are seeing young women are also included in that group, in that demographic. But on one hand, it being normalized, and on the other hand, also feeling that we can't get used to it. It's not something that you could possibly get used to. So because all that, the discourse and the institutions of liberal democracy have been unable to resolve this in the face of increasing state violence, and I'll respond to Brian's question on the relation between state violence and the Arusha Declaration and self-reliance. But it's in that instance that we are trying to think about how are we going to think through how are we going to address this horrific existence, because this is not working. At the same time, maybe we feel that it was never going to work anyway. That was That was not the purpose of liberal democracy. That was not why it was created. Understanding that, having very critical conversations about that in terms of the legacy of state formation. So these are the kind of discussions we were having, and these are the kind of demands or thinking that we are having when we are having the organizing around the Arusha Declaration. What does it mean to form social movements or to be part of social movement in the context of such brutality by the state, because of the fear and the silence that's enforced in the midst of, the economic struggles that are imminent in informal settlements. So how do you respond to an already completely disenfranchised community that now has to face the fear and repression of living in this kind of violence, and with the social movements, not social movements, I don't know what I would call them, but the formations, the liberal formations that have been extremely inadequate in responding to that. So these were it was very contemplative in terms of thinking through, first of all, the reason why we need to have we are thinking about self-reliance is because of that failure. This human rights, constitutionalism, and so on has also come to us through a lot of NGO organizations. So not only is that discourse useless and problematic in so many ways, but also disenfranchising in the ways that we've talked about, depoliticization. So we were talking about that, and people are very aware, because most of the time when you have these discussions, and people will be like, yo, is there a per diem, or do we get paid for coming? Because we know you guys are, because we feel that whenever you go to these organizations, you're getting paid to be here. You're at work, so I need to get paid as well, because I'm coming to help you do your work. So us thinking again around, okay, we need to think differently about how, because this is a critical issue facing these organizations, how are we going to do it? And these are the sort of responses that we need to create conditions of economic, first of all, especially economic self-reliance, because if we have that, then we have, if we are not constantly attending to the myriad troubles of economic survival, then we can also attend to the necessity of creating political platforms that are sustainable in the way of addressing, in the context of the depth of the state violence. So these were the conversations we were having.
Asante.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Back to somewhere there.
In the late 80s, predating that, across the continent, of anti-structural adjustment revolts that morphed into what was described as revolutions through the 1990s on a fantastic scale. Hardly researched, less looked at regularly, but lots of instructive lessons. Out of that period came perhaps the high point of popular protest on the continent, which was the events in Zimbabwe. After a series of IMF programs, homegrown structural adjustment, there were what were described as 2 red years, a sort of revolution, as described by the General Secretary of the ZCTU, which led directly to the formation of a mass workers' party, the MDC. And this was both an expression of this extraordinary moment of struggle against structural adjustment, answering many of the questions that we had in the first session about the role of a very small working class in the formal sector, but also in a reasonably developed manufacturing sector in Zimbabwe, and also students who'd been squeezed by attacks on their conditions in universities, and parents who were increasingly being made redundant. So this convergence of forces that gave a particularly explosive character to the nature of these protests across the continent, but particularly in this high point in Zimbabwe. The formation of the MDC, and you saw similar parties coming out of often a trade union federation, and with the pressure of strikes and protests often of many years behind that, was quickly seized on by very different social forces. So in the years afterwards, professionals, NGOs, who were increasingly siphoning off the best of the activists that had emerged in this period of heightened political struggle in Zimbabwe, and what activists described as the commodification of resistance, as we've discussed, which was a major block to developing those movements further. But the question that comes out of this for me, of which there doesn't seem to be direct answers, are twofold. One, how do we, and certainly perhaps questions for the workshop, one, how do we sustain these popular movements of protest after the initial wave of mobilization? These are old questions of social movements, ones that Fanon, Jean-Paul Sartre and others across the continent and elsewhere have raised. So after the Bastille has been seized, how do we maintain that force of social mobilization? The most important second question is organization, which we haven't really touched on, which seems to me at the heart of the Bolshevik revolution. So what role does organization, or popular organization, play in those social movements? And what does the absence of that organizational coherence mean for the dispersal of that popular energy in the revolutions that have taken place across the continent? So how do we sustain popular protest, and what is the role of organisation, of popular and socialist organisation, in the struggles that we're involved in and that take place on a regular basis?
Ruled by elites, you have to have strong stakeholders. So neoliberalism has created those chauvinistic nationalisms, and where it's been most aggressive, they've appeared most aggressively. And sometimes this is taken as a stick to beat the left with. You know, it's the same as the right, because the left is also talking about national projects and sovereignty. So I wondered, you know, how you see those tensions. It seems inevitable that, you know, we have to keep the states that we've inherited, and in a way we have to rewrite our national story, you know, whether it's an oppressed nation or a nation of oppressors. How do we rewrite it? I mean, I think the media has a very important role in that, in progressive movements. So it's just something I'd like us to discuss more as we go along. I'll leave it there and maybe come back to it.
Now, I would like to suggest to you, I will not discuss it, we can discuss it later. There wasn't that precisely the problem, the fundamental problem of Nyerere and which led to the defeat. They tried to build socialism through state, to make a revolution through state, which he saw as a non-class category, as a off classes. Maybe you want to refer to that. That partly answers, I think, Victor's question as well, to a certain extent. Then about Russian Revolution, what led to Russian Revolution's defeat? I've heard the argument of bureaucratic degeneration, the role of Stalin. That is a long-standing argument. Okay, for last, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades. I don't find it satisfactory at all. Because bureaucratic degeneration, what does it say? Okay? And giving Stalin all the responsibility for counter-revolution, certainly are very un-Marxist, to say the least. You see? But I would like to say that there has been some, of course it is developing, some very interesting arguments which led to the defeat of the Russian Revolution. One is that the best cadres of the Bolshevik party were destroyed during the Civil War, okay? Which created space for bureaucracy, for the party bureaucracy. Lenin talked about it in his last days. Okay? And secondly, the break in the working peasant alliance, working class peasant alliance, to collectivization. Those seem to be more kind of Marxist explanations rather than bureaucratic degeneration. Thirdly, Russian Revolution, of course, was not a model for Tanzania. No one says that. But we don't have models for revolutions. We can learn from other revolutions. There is no such thing as a model for the revolution. Revolution is based on very concrete conditions in the study that take place. On the question of statist, again, that is an old debate. I would want to suggest to you that the formulation by Amilcar Cabral is very interesting. He says that so long as imperialism exists, independence can only mean a national liberation movement in power. Okay. I think that's a very interesting formulation. Of course, we don't know how Cabral would have operationalized it because he made precise for that reason, because he's so far. And in Africa's history, at very critical periods, some very strategic individuals that we bumped off. Cabral was one of them. John Garang was another. Chris Handy was another. Okay? Chitepo in Zimbabwe was another, and so on and so forth. Now, academically, intellectually, we can say that what we really need to do, because the national liberation project is not complete. That question remains unresolved. Okay? So the question is, how do you combine the national and the social project? Now, that's intellectual. Okay? Finally, the most important fundamental question of the organization. Of course, the whole organization plays an important role. That's not an issue. The question is form of organization. Of course, a very concrete question. Okay? We know Vanguard Party, Lenin's Vanguard Party. There's a lot of debate on it. It certainly doesn't look like a principle. It's more a kind of particular concrete situation. Social movements, we have all shown our disappointment, etc. with it. Okay. In the morning time, we referred to Marcos, Commander Marcos' idea of pockets of struggle, pockets of resistance, pockets of struggle. How do you, if you use Bamba's term, how do you federate these pockets of struggle? The question still remains, what kind of organization? And I hope this discussion will continue when we discuss tomorrow as well. But one can say it's a concrete question, and so on and so forth. Of course, you cannot wait for the ideal form of organization to make a revolution, because it's a process. But that question is very fundamental.
Yes.
Ask you that if he wasn't conceiving of this as a social project, then what was the content of its existence as a national project? You alluded now in your comments to the answer that the national somehow stands above classes. But if you look carefully at the wording of the declaration, it's very clear, or the declaration is very clear that what the nation has as the the set of resources it can mobilize for its development in the absence of money is two things, and they both fall under hard work. Hard work in terms of being willing to work more hours, and hard work in terms of being willing to work more intelligently by using technology differently. So any Marxist would recognize these immediately as absolute and relative surplus value, or the conditions of absolute and relative surplus value. In other words, what's coming through in the declaration is that the national populace is being constituted precisely as a repository of labor power, of abstract labor. And if that's the case, then the nation begins to look like something which is being imagined as capital. Something that Marx warned against very strongly in much of his writing, the reconstitution of the community as a community of capital employing the people as labor power. So it sounds there as if what's being constituted is a kind of national capitalism rather than something which transcends class, or at least a way in which, despite the insistence on the difference between money and labor, the way labor is being imagined here is precisely what it looks like under the rule of money or under the rule of capital. So I wondered if you could reflect on that. I mean, if he didn't think that this was a social project, how was he imagining what this nation was? And should we be thinking about that if we're imagining some kind of return to that optimism in the potential of radical nationalism as being emancipatory?
I said subjectively, Nyerere did not conceive it as a social project. He did not. Was he building national capitalism? No. In fact, he does not talk about national capitalism until 1989, when he has stepped down. Okay? Objectively, it was a form of state capitalism. Objectively, it was a form of state capitalism, about which we debated in the 70s. Nyerere did not recognize it, he did not accept it, but that's what it was, until the 1981 Mongols.
Okay.
Issa,
You talked about Nyerere's conception of equality, contrasted it to the bourgeois equality, which is juridical in nature, equality before the law, and that Nyerere's notion of equality was premised on it was social equality. I think this is really a testimony to the fact that the Arusha Declaration was not just a political project. I read Socialism and Rural Development and was struck by one important question here. It seems to me that his notion of equality was underlain by some kind of moral imperative. He talks about working to build a rural society in which no one will be allowed to fall into, shall we say, extreme poverty without bringing his community into disrepute. I think that is, that the moral imperative is at work. And I was wondering what kind of intellectual currents or traditions are brought to bear in this regard. And I wanted to urge you to look into the possibility of the influence of Nyerere's Christianity as a devout practicing Catholic, and drawing upon some of the biblical tradition on these issues. That is my comment. My second comment is tangential to the issues here, and that is what you said about Tanzania being one African country that reconstructed its military and decolonized it. I think that is a moot point. You know, as I do, that this was a response to an army mutiny. They had to reconstruct it or just go under. And as you know, the army mutiny was actually disbanded by the British military, and the major military agents that helped to reconstruct this army was the Nigerian military, which I think holds its British military traditions very dear. Thank you.
Is to answer the question, whose revolution is this? Whose revolution? In most cases, these revolutions begin as people's revolutions. And that's what attracts so many people into them. Nora just talked about the NRM revolution, National Resistance Movement in Uganda. It started as a people's revolution. That was the outer agenda. But the inner agenda that we are now discovering today is that the revolution was for the president. And he mentioned it openly recently, that that was his revolution. For him, his children, and grandchildren. And therefore, all the people that come into this revolution, in most cases, misunderstand them. They think it is for the people. But as time goes on, you look at things, there is hegemony that is created. For example, in Uganda now, the president is almost a provider. Each group wants to associate with him, including the academia. Any university that is having problems has to approach the president to find a solution. A witch doctor must go to the president to find a solution. Because his revolution has succeeded, but the people's revolution has failed. She was talking about the Harambee revolution in Kenya. The Harambee revolution also started as a people's revolution, but Moi hijacked it to an extent that when the word Harambee was said, you would know that KANU has arrived, KANU members have arrived. It looked like a KANU project, and therefore you had to be KANU for you to be listened to when you are to run Harambee. And that's why these days with the death of Kanu, Harambee is almost dying. I have heard that you want to reactivate it through NGO, especially to fight against extrajudicial killings. But then you're going to get a lot of problems with the state, a lot of it, because the state will not believe in you. The state will look at you as an adversary who wants to take away their hegemony. In Tanzania here, I think listening to Sevigi quietly here, innocently in fact, I was finding out that yes, Nyerere might have been genuine about his Arusha Declaration. But once he started using the Arusha Declaration to build a state, a state that would continue governing the Republic of Tanzania, it hit a snag because his objectives of building a state do not rhyme with his earlier idea of coming up with a self-sustaining, equal society, because the state must somehow look oppressive. And that's why in 1970s, late 70s and 80s, there were a lot of problems. I was fascinated to read about a man who was kept in Nyasaland, never to come to Dar es Salaam, because he had criticized some of these things. So there you get to know the effects of the state. And in most parts of Africa, that is what has happened. And therefore, revolutions in most cases, as we had in the morning, fail because they lack ideology. They lack ideology, but they are very rich in interests. And therefore, people who join because of interests become revolutionaries. If you define ideology or you want to provide alternative ideology, you are considered as somebody who should die. Therefore, we should interrogate these issues, looking at where it began from. Every revolution, we need to look at whose revolution is this. Just like in the one in the Bolshevik, it was purportedly workers' revolution. But it later turned out not to be a workers' revolution. It was some other people's revolution. So as we look at these things, we need to see whose revolution is this. And once we answer whose revolution and for what and for whom, just like the questions that were asked in the morning, what went wrong, what can we do, and for whom? Thank you very much.
Discussing colonialism in Africa at the beginning and after independence, are there ways in which we can say that colonialism was progressive in the Marxist sense? Since, considering pre-colonial Africa, so colonialism brought Africa closer to this whole idea of revolution, socialist revolution. So would you say that colonialism was progressive? I really want to remember if it is there in the Marxist literature. Because all of us were supposed to head towards socialism. And so colonialism brought that possibility closer because it created working class, it created peasants. So it became possible for us to come towards a socialist revolution. So in that case, colonialism was progressive. Okay, I'm just asking, and I'm ignorant about that. The second question, and I really like this, the fact that we have this afternoon questioned the fact on how should the emancipatory projects look like since socialism did not succeed. So after the October Revolution, were there other missed opportunities that were not socialism? Are there any way, were there other forms, were there alternative forms of emancipation that were not necessarily socialism, and these forms maybe were missed because all of us were fascinated with this one way of changing the world, which was socialist on our way to building communism. Thank you very much.
So let me start with at the beginning of my thoughts. Ray Bush said we don't live in revolutionary times, and I think we do live in revolutionary times. Maybe not the way that we'd like them to go, but they are revolutionary times of which advantage might be taken. There is now a lot of talk up in the global north about post-capitalism. And the basis of that is in fact the way in which what we used to call productive forces, the way in which technology is now developed, is almost at such an advanced stage with the fourth industrial revolution or whatever, that with robotics and with all that technical change that is associated with it, there is now very slowly, or maybe even quicker than we think, a disjunction between the level of development of productive forces and the social relations of production. In other words, the way in which the level of technology is developed at such a level, at least in the global north, and it has a lot of implications for the rest of the world, that the social relations, the way society is organized, doesn't fit. Now, if you think that we're moving, again, this is the global north, so we need to talk about what that means for the global south, but we're moving in the global north to an economic system in which there is mass production of goods that are becoming cheaper and cheaper to produce and cheaper to buy. And increasingly a number of free goods, especially the technological free goods, like Google and all that stuff, all the software that we have. There's a very interesting book, it's a challenging book by Paul Mason called Post-Capitalism, which some of you may have read, which raises this interesting question about where capitalism, where global capitalism has actually got to. And the contradictions that are now increasingly occurring within capitalism are reflected also in the inequality story within capitalism of a mass of people who are becoming increasingly impoverished, either absolutely or relatively, and a very small plutocracy of 1% or even 0.1% who are becoming extraordinarily rich. And a global corporate structure that is so concentrated that a very small number of global corporates, mainly financials, control a large part of global capital. So then the question arises, how can this continue without major social disruption? Because increasingly the employment opportunities are diminished. So unless we move to societies where there is much less labour required of everybody, or to societies where there is a basic income, there will be a revolution of some sort. And of course, the way capitalism is beginning to protect itself is to ensure that there are massive security and, of course, military forces in place, maybe anticipating this kind of crisis. So then the question will be how we will deal with it. Now, the other question, of course, this is very much a North thing, maybe, but it also has implications for the global South, because it also means that the industrialization story, which we were talking about in Africa, the industrialization story is going to be a little bit different. Because if countries in the global South are going to advance to a more advanced industrialization with the highest levels of existing technology, then the question is, how is that going to create a large amount of employment and indeed create an industrial proletariat? And so then the question is, what kind of working people, a term I prefer as well, what kind of working people would there be in these kinds of societies? What kind of economic structure would they have? How far would they be sharing in the global wealth of the global north? These are, I think, important questions. I have no answers to that, but I think these are things we need to be thinking about. Because what's happened in the last 50 years in the global north is a massive change in technology. Some of the technologies we never even thought about 50 years ago are now commonplace. And so we have to think in terms of the way that these things have changed so rapidly. And I don't think that that social relations have actually kept pace. And I think what we now have is very powerful forces, very powerful states that are, as Marx and Engels had in their Communist Manifesto, the economic committee of the bourgeoisie, now the economic committee of the global corporates. And I think we have to think about what are the implications for all of that. And as far as relating to the subject of this topic, the legacy of the Russian Revolution, it's been my view for a long time. The Russian Revolution was a great thing, but it took place at the wrong time. And of course, what it did was eventually lead to the development of capitalism in a big way in Russia, and really to the development of military capitalism. And that's one of the sad things about it, but that's the way it clearly went. And the way it went, I think, was because the social relations of production were not in place, and the level of productive forces were not there to enable any kind of socialism to take place, let alone in one country.
And maybe the concept is wrong.
If I want to respond to it.
There's 2 points. I agree with you what you said about, for example, the global north, but I think we should take into account that the post-war Keynesian consensus is of course breaking down, right? And even the model of liberal democracy in the north is breaking down. What you have is, as you put it, very small countries. Now, politically, in absence of a real rise in left, it opens up rightists filling that vacuum. And therefore we should not dismiss the potential for fascism in global north. On the global south, industrialization, in fact, okay, it seems to me that industrialization, which is by the supported by the north, in south, would be a way of rescuing their capitalism by exporting the dirty industries in the global south, with so-called EPZ zones, etc., which also China would also take account of. So industrialization itself, without investigating the character of industrialization, seems to me does not necessarily creating proletariat and so on and so forth. So that possibility is very strongly there. And in our this enthusiasm about industrializing, we're actually importing not technologically developed industries, technologically backward industries.
Acceleration projects or any other modernizationist projects, and there is this very important debate on whether it was a genuine delinking attempt, a revolutionary project, or in fact it was the state was mediating global capital forces into a local context. In fact, it was a capitalist state, and we have this debate in Eastern Europe as well. And I very much agree with what Professor Shiji said, that if you look at it objectively, it was state capitalism. And what I wanted to add, that there is another kind of debate which is interesting here in this assessment, which I wanted to emphasize is about the historical circumstances when we have this nostalgia, when we want to return at all to this period. And well, the question is like, what really the post-war capitalist stage of development was, and when and how it ended, because it ended in a very different stage of capitalist development among very different circumstances. So these debates, what we have in Eastern Europe, is about would it even be possible to return to a previous stage of capitalism, and well, of course, so it's there's this argument that it's not even possible. Thank you.
The situation with regard to dominant ideas, I asked this question earlier this morning. How has neoliberalism, for instance, influenced the battle of ideas, or what is now the dominant ideas, etc., in society, or accepted, common sense and so on? Well, especially when it comes to capitalism. I study Uganda, right? So I'm often there, and of course Museveni and the donor bloc, etc., the corporates seem to have succeeded in saying modernization is what's all about, and more infrastructure, etc., more capitalism basically. So I just wanted to ask some of those who have, further insights to go for these points of where are we at in terms of the dominant ideas after 30 years of neoliberal ideological influence. And my second point is to think a little bit about how will imperial powers possibly respond to any challenge, to any serious challenge, and what can we learn from Latin America, how they have tackled, the Latin America challenge, in Brazil and Venezuela especially. So what do those comrades here in the room who have more insights into internal politics and how easily, or in what way imperialism influences their internal politics, especially when it comes to serious challenges and including killings, etc., of upcoming critics, etc., or other ways of. So what do we have in the field in concrete terms along those 2 points?
Now, before we come back, I will let these 2 guys here. They wanted to respond. They have been pushing me. They want to say something.
I think that notion only kind of makes sense in the sort of, and I'm using, in regard to all the conversations about sort of the defeat of the Russian Revolution, I'm using the term Stalinist as sort of shorthand for a much more complicated process, but I think it only kind of makes sense in that sort of two-stage, that very kind of rigid, stagist notion that comes out of the defeat of the Russian Revolution, sort of Stalin, and sort of Stalin's theories around that, but not actually a Marxist understanding of the absolutely, completely devastating, extractive, exploitive nature of colonialism. And I think that, so in short, no. But the thing that I want to say before the question came up and why I wanted to get back on the stack was that I think it's still important to start, or to sort of pick up where Professor Shivji laid off around the fact that that socialism is sort of back as a question after decades of sort of neoliberal kind of destruction. And I think it's important because it was clear in what you were saying, Newsom, about sort of how important it was for you to be reading these documents again in light of a very different kind of situation at some distance from their original production. And I think that in my time in Congo, Brazzaville, and Senegal, it's also true that the legacy of the '68 strike and uprising in Dakar and legacy of the Congolese Revolution, and those writers are also being revisited by a much sort of younger generation in a way that I think the ideas, speak to them, and that those writers really emphasize the importance of democratic participation and self-activity. Now, it was always within the constraints of that national project and within the party. So when Professor Shivji and his colleagues were banned, in their political activities here at the university in 1970, I was rereading the article that was published in the party paper in The Nationalist, talking about saying that we're not trying to stop young people from being radical and revolutionary. In fact, young people can be as radical and revolutionary as they want to be, as long as they do so within the institutions of the party. And I think that precisely speaks to the kind of contradictions that lay at this question of sort of why did these projects and why did the Arusha Declaration sort of fail, which is that at the root of it in practice, the sort of space for self-activity and self-initiative were actually sort of stamped out, or were very much at least kind of delimited in such a way that it made, that was sort of taken out of the projects, not only of socialism, but also of Pan-Africanism, and you ended up with not just sort of a sort of socialism from the top down, but also I think it's part of the reason why a lot of the Pan-African initiatives of this time also fell on hard times, because it was also sort of a Pan-Africanism of the top that necessitated the silencing of minority opinions, of ethnic minorities that crossed borders, in the construction of those nation states, and that actually made building real Pan-African solidarity much more difficult. And I think that points to today the importance of this sort of self-activity and really bringing that into organizations, not just as a way of sort of creating an island or a refuge or a sense of sort of space from the state, but actually as mechanisms to actually create the experiences that we need in the sort of democratic decision-making and debate that we need to actually challenge the state. And I think that's regardless of whether, from the first discussion, people are on the page of sort of where different ruling classes are at on the continent. I think we can only go so far without sort of raising the question of how are we going to be organized to actually confront the state.
Yeah, before I come to the things that really matter, this is money. I try a short answer to your question with colonialism progressive. Okay, I would say, as a Marxist, all exploitive forms of human society had developed a certain form of capitalism, colonialism. And if you want to talk about capitalistic or capitalist colonialism, you have to talk about capitalism, and then the question is capitalism progressive? So, okay, you may answer this question for yourself. Okay, there's no capitalism without colonialism. That's my firm opinion. Now coming to the money issues. Okay, it's absolutely necessary in capitalism to become as rich as possible. Look, if the whole distribution of goods is in line with shortage of resources, then the last gallon of petrol will be hard, it will be difficult for Mr. Zuckerberg or Mr. Gates to buy it. It will be so expensive, incredibly expensive, that even those people can't buy them, can't buy the last gallon of petrol. So meaning that the more money you have, the richer you are, the less you have to adjust. You are the last to have to adjust. All others poor people can't afford no cars, can't afford no, electricity, or any kind of other resources. Before they are finished, they will become extraordinarily expensive. And if you're not a very rich man, you have to adjust very early, so you have to drop out of the system of consumers. So this is the rationale behind this. But I think the balance is even worse. And there's no such kind of pure technological solution. Look at this fancy thing about electricity-powered cars. Currently, as we speak, the thing, if you count all the CO2 emissions that are necessary to produce this thing, in particular the batteries, so the whole thing is emitting more CO2 than an ordinary car in its whole lifespan, meaning from the process of production until the thing is going to be recycled, hopefully. Meaning that so the electricity-powered car is a kind of a myth. That's a simple thing. And we do not know what to do with the batteries in the future, and we do not know how to recycle the solar panels, and we have a lot of problems with all the kinds of toxic waste that we are producing. The balance of resources is not just oil and not just iron ore, copper ore, whatever. It includes human labor force as well. But not in a capitalistic way. If you say, okay, if it's employed under capitalism, then you have always this past dependency towards a technological solution. But this is a social question. So if you want to have a fair or more even distributed access to goods and resources, then labor is very part of that. So meaning we will have to see what we can do with a lot of labor force and with less consumption of natural resources in order to spare this, or in order to extend the period of where we can for the period of where we can use this, or in that time span where we can use this stuff. And there's already a lot of things that have already been done by when you say the final form of recycling is burning. So what is, when it is burned, it's finished with recycling. So the recycling industry is also just in the beginning. We have not yet made a lot of progress. In Germany, they have this kind of collecting different kinds of waste separately. So, but you shouldn't think that this is going to be recycled, all of this. Less than 30% is recycled, the rest is burned or whatever, or dumped somewhere. So meaning that we are still at the beginning of such things. So the next and final point regarding money is how do we fund the revolution, or why do social movements need to be refunded or need to be sponsored? This notion came up in 4 or 5 years ago when we did a survey in West Africa on the question of the state of social movements. And we asked a number of people, I think 13, who were writing up contributions to the book. The book is the state of social movements in West Africa. And interestingly, a lot of authors discovered a lot of social movements in their country. So, and look, from the Marxist, or let's say that that's what I explained, I started with the transition from one state of society to another. The motive power were social movements, but the social movements came out of the system, were produced by the system, were inspired by the system, eventually reached a situation what Lenin explained as a revolutionary situation. The oppressors can no longer oppress, and the oppressor can no longer survive, so they are forced to change something. But this is a revolution, it's very short. So, meaning that this is created out of the society itself. But given the situation in West Africa or other places that working class is not really a factor, so they were looking desperately for other social forces. And discovered a lot of claim-making organizations. And interestingly, many of these claim-making, sometimes single-issue organizations were identifying themselves as social movements. So, and when we had the launch of the book was a big conference in Dakar. I think German Buhari attended this conference in Dakar the other day. So the question came up, so now we have such a lot of social movements, but they are so poor, they need funding. So people did not even realize that this is a contradiction in itself when it comes to the whole concept how social change is happening.
Okay,
so this is just, I wanted to clarify this because I was asked to for.
Thank you very much. Now, comrades, and I'm deliberating calling you comrades so that you can agree with what I'm going to suggest. Comrades also want to rest so that they can come early tomorrow with energy and they can continue the discussion actively. So I'm going to take 5 minutes from now, and I will allow very short, precise contributions. And after that, I think we'll call it a day. And I am aware of that. So tomorrow, because some of the issues like the question that was raised on the social forms of organization, etc., I think that is going to be dealt with tomorrow in detail, because the session tomorrow is going to, there is a special session for that, the agents, the social agents for that. So some of the issues that have been raised from this discussion are going to be continued tomorrow. So I think I should allow you, I'll give you 1.5 minutes. Yeah, we can't negotiate, and I will negotiate by myself, so I give you the opportunity. And then
I wanted to respond to the activism.
Okay. You are responding
to the
1 minute?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Your hand is up? Tomorrow. Tomorrow, oh good. And then I see your hand.
Part of the question where we now that you're raised, and I want to link it to the sort of Europe and North America a little bit. I think what we need to remind ourselves of is, I mean, if I was a member of the bourgeoisie and in this room now, I think what a bunch of miserable sods you socialists are. You're also miserable and negative, and of course in part it feels because we've lost, and there has been many losses. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union weighs still very heavily on all our shoulders. But of course we're also looking for models, but there will never be any perfect models. The struggle will work out the answer in a very concrete fashion. So the issues we're grappling with are very difficult, very challenging, and it can be demoralizing in many ways. But I want to just remind us that actually we must not forget that their system is in absolute political crisis. The economic crisis of 2008 that started in the global north has led to a political legitimacy crisis. I don't think the economic crisis has been solved. It's very fragile, and even the boss's newspaper in Britain, the Financial Times, talks about that incessantly. The global north bourgeoisie are petrified of the so-called recovery tipping back into crisis, point one. Secondly, the political crisis is very real and very deep and it's unprecedented. Shidji was right to say that we mustn't rule out the shift to the far right with fascism in Europe. And that's absolutely true, but it's only like looking at Europe with one eye open. Europe is much more polarised in a very exciting way. So don't be fed into believe that America is full of people who just simply support Trump. Trump did not win the majority of votes in America. Okay? The fascist Marine Le Pen nearly got to the presidency in France, but she was only beaten by 750,000 votes to a radical far-left socialist Mélenchon. So the balance is very fine in Europe. The rise of Corbyn in Britain is fascinating and unprecedented and very, very exciting. It's mobilised hundreds of thousands of young people in ways that we've not seen in generations, by a man who speaks on an openly socialist, anti-imperialist platform in the midst of the beast. In the midst of a terrorist bombing in Britain, he came out with an anti-imperialist argument, and he became within a cat's whisper of winning the election in the UK. I could go on. Syriza in Greece has been exciting. There are big developments in Ireland in a radical far left. You have a socialist, social democratic, anti-austerity government in Portugal. So Europe is polarised. The bourgeois electoral system is in crisis. Italy currently doesn't have a bourgeois government. They can't decide amongst themselves. Italy didn't have a bourgeois government a couple of years ago. The EU imposed it on them. Spain has a bourgeois government in crisis because the far radical left have risen from nowhere, from Podemos, from a movement that said they were against elections, has formed a party and nearly won an election. So people's ideas change very quickly in struggle. So I think there are lots of opportunities in the global north. So yes, there's many dangers. I'm not ruling that out. Shidji's right. But we'd be foolish to say there aren't many, many opportunities. There are. Whether we can take them, whether we can win them, it'll be sorted out in struggle.
I will just ask you one question. Question will rely on existence of the movement. With the existence of movement, I think we can just think how we can just reproduce the movement in the revolutionary country. So, the leftists, what are the essence of existing for the future if we don't have the registration of the revolutionary card? And what do we think on that? We are youth, we don't know about the leftist card, culture of registration. What do you think on this? And the second one to add is on survival and the that raised by Nosim, community Nosim, surviving the struggle, So you can just give us experience because we have been living in survival and the struggle. Our comrades, we're youth, we're youngster, and you are our elders. Can you give us some experiences, how you survived and how you struggle with life? Because life is a struggle, and how can you just go to the leftist while you still struggle? Thanks.
The big issues for me, I think that there has been a blurring of lines. Religion, the role that religion is playing in my country or in Africa as wide promotes the neoliberal debate. So you have these prosperity gospel where the individual is blamed for their poverty, and that if you are a child of God, you will become rich, and then you have to give to God in order for you to become rich, and there's that whole religion playing, I think, a similar role that missionaries did at the time of colonialism. Then there's a whole idea of the blurring of lines of not-for-profit organizations that are now actually for government. Earlier on in the 1990s, when I first joined the not-for-profit sector, for example, Oxfam was not taking money from the state. But now Oxfam is heavily funded by the UK government. And the most recent scandal was mind-blowing for me, because when I started, Oxfam was dependent on charitable donations from individual persons, from their shops. But now Oxfam is actually carrying out the will of the British government. Yes. And therefore, Oxfam is carrying on the will of neoliberalist capital. And that is the same for all other organizations. If you go to the Dutch, everybody, the NGOs there, which never used to take money and say we're church-based, are now taking money from government specifically to carry out their role on behalf of government. And so now, instead of them coming to look for partners to partner with socialist movements or real activism outside of government, there's what they call for proposals, with clear dimensions of what the call for proposals is. It is no longer, let us look for an exciting movement and let us move the global civil society together with the global north and civil society together with the global south and civil society. And so those are the big issues. I'll give you an example of Uganda, land now. I come from a community of the Iteso, the First Nations of Uganda before colonialism. I'm from Teso, and in Teso we had our own land tenure system. Our land tenure systems which were written into law as customary tenure. And in our constitution, it was said customary tenure will be governed by the laws of the particular community. Now they want to change the constitution to take that out because global capital finds it very difficult to deal with us at the community level. And in order to take that out, they are forcing us to register our land through the legal system, which they are calling certificates of tenure. To certify our land as certificates of tenure removes the whole essence of group ownership of the land, because one individual who speaks English like me will go and register that land, and I can then sell it to the big corporations that want to access the land, and then I am removed off of the land. So they don't take the nuances of land use rights, and our system is based on land use rights. If you are on the land, you use it, but now it is a primitive accumulation of land is pushing the system. NGOs are the ones that the World Bank has chosen to popularize certificates. And so they go and find, if, like I am, they find if you are advocating against certification of land, the factoid or the rhetoric that will be used is that you are backward, and you are backward thinking we need to move on to modernization, industrialization, and therefore registration of land is part of modernization and civilization to easily trade in land, something like that.
Oh, thank you.
I've tried.
Thank you. I've tried so much. Unfortunately, you have provoked a new discussion.
I should take a shorter time than that. I just wanted to pose the question or thought. The centralizing bureaucracy that is a fundamental element of the modern state as we know it. And the contradiction therein that lied with Nyerere insisting on a radical participatory democracy in the way of implementing self-reliance. And then coupled with the legal, as we know it, the legality that is also a fundamental element of the modern state. That was an abstraction from the colonies, created actually within the colonies and placed within and also fundamentally then the premise of private property. How then do we expect that not to develop into nationalist capitalism? I'm just wondering. So it almost for me is as if it was never going to work anyway in terms of the way the state is structured. His ambitions, he was undermining the very structures that he was seeking to build by his position as the head of state of an institution that could never or was never created to facilitate participatory democracy. And so what we are trying to do, I think, in terms of forging social movements within the region or within is critically think about for us self-reliance, because as he said, the concept of survival for us is critical. The amount of time we spend trying to think about, mobilize around, organize around, form structures of organizing around, for instance, the Olporor system, the Maas system of age grade organizations. How can that be perhaps rejuvenated in a way that's useful productively for us to organize economically and politically? We're thinking about that, and that requires a lot of time and effort and investigation. And that time, because we are hustling, and doing 6 jobs at the same time. We don't have that time. So this is why cooperatives are crucial, and we are thinking about them, not just thinking abstractly, but really meeting regularly and thinking about how are we going to form cooperatives, which ones are useful, how are we going to organize around the question of labor. So we are actually in practice thinking about this, exchanging notes with our comrades in different spaces within the continent actually. So which is where we have the Jama Collective. And it's not a nationalist collective, it's a collective of people within this space trying to understand and forge our future in praxis, not only theoretically. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. On the content and yourselves. We had a very good discussion, so many issues, but I think they have built on very well on the morning discussion, and it has answered some of the issues, not answered basically, clarified and enriched some of the discussions that I started in the morning. And one interesting issue that I think we should continue discussing is, there are so many, I think someone pointed out the issue that there are so many pockets of resistance and struggle. And Lisa was talking of the issue of how do you federate them. I think the issue of how do you federate them ideologically and in terms of forming a movement or a force against imperialism at the global level and nationally. What would that be? How would that be? How can that be organized and done? And I think that remains to be an important question. I hope we'll continue discussing it tomorrow. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.